Welcome to the Season 2, Episode 2 of Point of View, a series of leadership discussions by amazing workplaces. We sincerely believe that no workplace can become amazing without the people who lead and show the way and who relentlessly work on the various aspects of creating happy and productive workplaces. They are the real leaders, not just in title, but in the true sense of the word. Through Point of View series, I'm getting into a discussion with these people in leadership roles from various organizations spread across India as well as across borders. The idea is to get into conversation with them, to get them to share their views about the various aspects that make organizations really amazing. The purpose is to understand what drives leaders to their own workplaces so that we can delve deeper into the corporate philosophy and share with you path breaking ideas. Ideas that come straight from people who have gone ahead and changed their workplace to make them better, more inviting, and extremely thriving for their own people. Our guest on the show today is an HR professional who is extremely passionate about culture transformation in organizations. He has had the experience of working in many organizations with an extremely strong culture and has also studied various other organizations on how they bring their culture to life. Let me present to you Sumit Mundra, Director HR at Gartner, a global research and advisory firm. Sumit has set up teams from scratch and led teams with footprints in all habitable continents of the world. He is deeply passionate about learning and capability building. Besides, having been instrumental in designing programs for different leadership cohorts, he has also developed content and curriculum and leveraged blended learning to create unique learning experiences for employees. Sumit enjoys bringing lessons from diverse disciplines like neuroscience, somatic science, behavioral psychology, positive psychology, etc., to his professional life as an HR practitioner, facilitator, and coach. So let's welcome Sumit Mundra, Director HR Gartner, and speak to him about transforming culture, a topic that he is really passionate about. Hi, Sumit. Welcome to Point of View. I'm really so excited to have you on the show today.
Hi, Ekta. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you, Sumit. It's a great pleasure for us to be able to speak to you today and get insights from your immense experience in the field of culture and understand what culture is all about. I'm really so excited to take this discussion forward with you.
Absolutely, likewise. And just a sort of quick disclaimer, Ekta,
Yeah.
the views that I'd like to share would be in my personal capacity, not necessarily reflecting the views of my current and past employers, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure. In fact, we are trying to understand more from your experience, yeah, rather than any organization that you're representing. Okay, so it's all about you as a leader and what your experience has taught you over all these years, right? Okay, so Sumit, you have more than a decade and a half of experience as a practitioner and advisor in HR. You worked on various wide ranging topics related to leadership, talent development, organization culture, change management, and strategic communication. So, I was just wondering what aspects of a workplace do you find the most intriguing and most challenging?
Sure. So, actually, I've had the privilege of working with some of the best known companies, and also by virtue of my role, I got a chance to study a lot of other companies around the world, and that vantage point gives me a sense to appreciate workplaces a lot more closely than I would have otherwise had I not got a chance to play these different roles. Um, Interestingly, your question has two elements. One is around the element of intrigue, and the second is around challenge. To me, both these questions are quite interrelated. When I look at organizations, in terms of organizations who are able to inspire employees, whether it's the CEO or the janitors, to basically turn up for work every single day and give their best. To me, that's an amazing workplace to be able to draw that inspiration, to be able to provide that inspiration. Second, when I also look at companies which are very well spread out, say global companies that have presence from Hong Kong to Sao Paulo, and every time you interact with an employee, invariably you'll realize that the employee interaction patterns are very similar. You'll realize that you have the same quality of interaction whether a colleague is based in a continent like Asia Pacific or South America. And that's when you realize that there is something amazing about such workplaces that are able to build consistency from one region to another, from one hierarchy to another. To me, I look at these organizations with a sense of awe, because not only is it very perplexing on how they have been able to do that, but I also understand that it's very difficult to do that. Now, imagine a startup company. It's a small, it's almost like a family. But as soon as it starts to expand, it starts to face a bit of a challenge on how to continue inspiring new people who join the company to espouse the same set of values. And my firm belief is that the fundamental way of how companies are able to do that is by giving them a sense of purpose, a common purpose that each employee can associate themselves with, and also create a culture that basically makes employees feel a part of the overall fabric. And it's the sense of purpose and a sense of culture that is able to hold the glue together, and that to me creates an amazing workplace. And I am always fascinated when I look at some of these global companies and how they are able to bring that consistency both in terms of vertical hierarchy as well as from a horizontal spread.
Okay, pretty interesting. Yeah. So, Sumit, you are passionate about culture transformation. You have coached clients and built business leaders on driving change and embedding it in the culture of their team and organization. And you have made that change stick. So, according to you, what is the simplest way to define culture, and how does culture impact the working of an organization? In fact, how can culture make or break an organization?
Sure, it's a fascinating question, and as I was reflecting on this question, there are two words that strike my mind. One is identity, and the second is experience. Um, so what I mean by identity is that a company that wants to create a specific culture, it would want that culture to be a part of its identity. So for example, Apple wants to be known as an innovative culture. It will therefore make innovation as a part of its identity. That's how Apple would want to be known as to the rest of the world. So that's like one part of it. The second part of it is, how is that company able to translate that identity into experiences? So how can we, using Apple products, can appreciate the innovative culture? And that's, therefore it goes hand in hand. One is a sense of identity that a company needs to create as a part of a definition of culture, and the second is the experiences that it's able to provide. Now, that experiences can be to its employees, can be to its stakeholders, or can be to its customers. And that's how a company is able to bring its identity, i.e., its culture, to life. Now, I'm often reminded of this parable of elephant and the blind men whenever I think of culture. Now, the parable says that there were blind men trying to explore different parts of the elephant. So the blind man who was touching the tusk, for him, the tusk was the elephant. For someone who was touching the trunk was the elephant. For someone who was touching the tail was the elephant. Now, culture is very similar. It's the part of the organization that you are a part of or you're experiencing that becomes the culture for you. There is rarely a culture which is very uniform from one team to another, from one region to another. What global organizations or best in class companies do well is that they are able to bring that consistency from one team to another, from one geography to another.
Right.
And that's how they are able to create that culture, so that a tusk doesn't seem very different from a tail, taking that parable forward. And that's what great cultures or companies with great cultures do. Now, they pay a lot of attention to how they create that great culture. How do you ensure that the tusk seems very similar to the tail? And I've seen a couple of ways of how companies have done that. For example, maybe the look and feel. If you walk into any global organization, the look and feel of the office will be very similar. The color schemes, etc., will look very, very similar because that's the culture that they would want to build. A culture of consistency. It could also manifest in the form of logos, a company logo. Banking companies, for example, they typically resort to using blue as a color for their logo because blue is a color of trust. And if a bank wants its customers to trust them with their money, they would want to sort of exude that kind of culture, that image, that identity in every different ways, including the color of the logo. And therefore, you'll realize that most of the banks, they actually have a blue colored logo. That's their way of telling that we stand for a culture of trust. It also manifests in semantics, the language that the company use. Um, for example, in Gartner, we've been very conscious of using language that basically depict our overall frame of mind and our overall culture. For example, during COVID, we very consciously started to use, the art of possible, so that at least we were bringing hope to people, hope to our associates, so that they were able to overcome and see beyond COVID. Second, we also started to use a lot of language around balancing empathy with expectation. We all knew that times were tough, and it would be very difficult for people to live up to their targets. And therefore, we wanted to consciously build in that narrative of how to balance empathy with expectation, so that the managers leading the respective teams also understood what was the need of the hour. So summing up, companies, great companies, they would want to drive consistency, and that consistency can be in different ways, can be very explicit in the form of logo, can be very implicit in the form of narrative and the choice of language. And that's what builds strong culture. Now, to your second part of the question, in terms of can culture make or break organizations? Now, the fascinating anecdote that I'm reminded of is when I look at the 2008 meltdown. Interestingly, banks that basically had a growth strategy as their part of their, as a part of the overall strategy, immediately translated into a culture of greed. And that led to the downfall because somehow and suddenly bankers were now no longer looking at growth as a strategy, but they were suddenly fascinated by their ability to earn a lot of money. And because culture did not act as a guardrail for strategy, it was a downward spiral, and that led to so many of these banks going bust, eventually leading to a meltdown. So can culture jeopardize the existence of a company? Absolutely it can, especially if culture doesn't act as a guardrail. It can quickly make the strategy go out of control. So that would be my take on culture and its importance in organizations.
Thank you, Sumit. I think you explained this pretty well. And one thing we always talk about company culture from the employee perspective. But like you quoted the example of Apple, it is actually about, it's a transparent kind of a image between the organization, the employee on one side, and the customer on the other, right? So they all have to see the same visual that the company wants them to see.
Yeah,
Unless there's a total synergy in everything that a company does as per what their culture charter talks about,
yeah,
there would be some kind of miscommunication in that image, right?
absolutely,
So if you're
absolutely.
talking about trust but you're actually not doing it with your customers, somewhere even the employees would feel ki, oh, we talked about something but we are actually not delivering it to the customers, and then once you are in a confusion, you're actually not really following the culture.
That's true. Because, when I think of culture, a more simple and relatable example that I often think of is, culture is like a dal bukhara. It's developed over time. It's a recipe that is perfected over time. It's something which is done with a lot of love and care, with involvement from everyone. Because, when you look at the folklore of dal bukhara, every employee of that restaurant contributes to developing that dish. And the beauty of dal bukhara is that it tastes the same every single day, so there is consistency. So you can't have a company that gives an experience of a certain culture on day 1, and on day 29 it gives a totally different experience. There has to be an element of consistency, because if it is not, then it's not a part of your culture. So to me, culture is very similar to a dal bukhara. It's developed, perfected over time, but the beauty is in terms of consistency. It tastes the same over and over again.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Sumit. That was pretty interesting. So, Sumit, uh, we are discussing culture in detail with you, and I'm quite, inquisitive to learn from you that from a mediocre culture to a culture, where employees are proud of the organization, does it really happen? And given your vast and varied experience, can you help us understand how organizations can bring about the shift? We were just mentioning about dal bukhara, that it's developed over time. One thing I understand from this is that yes, it can be done. Yeah. And but how can organizations do it? I think that is the point we would like to understand from you.
Sure, sure. Let me give you a sort of a three simple elements that I feel companies can work on to bring a shift, to be known as as organizations with a strong culture. And this is something which I've witnessed in a lot of companies. First is a sense of common purpose, I realize. And this is something which is so fundamental. A company that wants to stand for a specific culture, it has to start from the top. It has to start with what is the overall purpose why the company exists, its sense of mission. Disney wants to make people happy, and everything else basically flows from that. And if they are unable to sort of set a common goal for its employees, they will no longer have employees across region basically work towards realizing that purpose. So that sense of purpose is possibly the step one of how companies can create a culture which is strong, which they can also relate to. And there are different ways of how companies do that. One, talking very openly about their culture, or in some ways via their value statement. Johnson and Johnson, for example, it has printed its overall values in J&J Credo, and that's something that each employee who joins Johnson and Johnson basically lives by. And it's like almost hard coded from the day when they join Johnson and Johnson. Not only is it important to talk about culture or values, but it's also important to reaffirm those values, revisit those values. When you look at maybe a company like a McKinsey and Company, they celebrate their values every year. One single day when the firm stands still, and what they do is they discuss, debate, and reaffirm to the firm values, because that's the way of how they would want to continue realizing their dual mission statement of client and looking after their people. So it's something which doesn't happen by accident. It happens only when you take care and a common sense of purpose. So that's point number one, having a common sense of purpose which acts as a compass that guides all the employees forward. The second is in terms of enablers. What have companies done in order to provide the right environment or the right enabler for the employees to create that culture, to live that culture, to experience that culture? And there are several examples that come to mind. For example, when you look at the Ritz-Carlton rule, it basically empowers every single employee of Ritz-Carlton to spend close to $2,000 to create that wow experience for its customers. That's almost like empowering their frontline to create that wow experience, for them to create that unique Ritz-Carlton culture. So that's like one. Second is in terms of, you might recall almost like 20-25 years back, we used to do banking in the traditional visit the branch, sort of in cash money through a cashier. And suddenly now there are hardly people who go to branch. People do banking over mobile, over digital banking, over laptops. Now that is like a sea change in terms of the operating model. But then it also started with some basic steps of how the branches became computerized. Now imagine a teller who was used to dispensing cash suddenly having to work on a laptop, on a computer. Now that was a sea change. No wonder it also saw a lot of resistance, because people had to learn something new. They had to learn a new skill. So if for organizations to create that new culture of serving customers in the way they would want, it also needs to build that right skills as well. Because if they don't build that right skills, they will no longer be able to um, empower and equip their employees to sort of live in the new culture. So that is like one of the important ways of how you can build that right skills for employees to basically live the new culture. You would often hear stories about how, say, Disney creates that wow experience as well. And what they do is they have a specific operating manual for each of the employees. Even janitors, for example, they have a specific manual that says, that lists down what they need to do. If you visit any of the Disney parks, you'll realize that their garbage bags are never full, because the operating manual, what it says is that when the garbage bag is 65% full, they basically need to replace. Their washrooms are always very clear. Now it's a fascinating strategy, starts with customer, but when the front line starts to live by it via an operating manual, that's when the customer experience also starts to become very real. So to me, the second important element is the enabler, which can happen when you build the right skills, when you have the right operating manual, and also when you build the right kind of rules that empower the front line. So to me, that's like the second part. The third part is role modeling. Employees, you can have the right manuals, you can build the right skills, but if they don't have leaders who basically role model and walk the talk, you will never have employees who will basically sort of live it every single day. And that is where organizations that have strong culture also have leaders who role model. The stories of how a CEO of an airline in US basically serving peanuts on flights, we all know about these. And that's how the CEO basically drives home the point that no job is big enough, and that I as a CEO can also serve peanuts. We also have heard stories of how CEO of a big bank uh, basically was fielding calls as a call center agent because he wanted to hear the voice of the customers firsthand. So, these are examples of strong role modeling where CEOs send a very strong signal that to me, the culture of this workplace is important. And that's how companies can bring that shift, having that sense of purpose, building the right enablers in place. And third is leadership role modeling. That's the only way of how companies can bring this about.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think that was a really wonderful answer, and you've explained it, so clearly. Uh, Talking about purpose, enabling the employees, and then obviously leaders being the role models, right? So, Sumit, in your role as an HR leader, how do you feel about the statement that culture eats strategy for breakfast by the legendary management consultant and writer Peter Drucker?
First of all, I find this statement to be extremely flattering because, in some ways, for people look at HR as the custodians of culture, and actually to be told that culture can eat strategy for breakfast sounds extremely flattering. Culture without a strategy is almost like a headless chicken. It will basically run amok in an uncontrollable way. And strategy without culture is almost like running on steroids. It can give you a temporary high, but it can't be sustainable. And that's how I look at. There has to be an element of balance. It can't be an either or. I'll give you an example. It's a personal example, and the more I reflect on it, the more it makes me believe how this balance is extremely important. So in 2017, I went with my family to a resort in Missouri, the Marriott Resort in Missouri. So I stayed there for a weekend, and when I was checking out, I was basically completing the formalities. I saw three specific actions which were very eye opening for me. First, I saw the bellboy basically vanish inside a room and come back with two small boxes, and that basically were gifts. And he basically gave those two gifts to both my kids. It had small Rudraksh, small gift for my kids. No one told him. This is something that he did on his own. So that to me was like fascinating. Second, I could see from the corner of my eyes how the Darwan was basically opening the doors of my car and stashing in water bottles because I was supposed to drive from Missouri back to Delhi. Third, I saw one of the junior chefs come running with a small hamper, and he said, frankly, it's a long drive from Missouri to Delhi. So in case if you don't want to stop by, I just thought maybe I'll make some muffins and sandwiches for your kids. Now, to me, these three different actions which I saw unfold in front of my eyes were not in isolation. It wasn't an accident. I could sense that each of these individuals who were Marriott employees were doing something because they had a sense of pride in what they were doing. They also had a sense of empowerment. that if I do something, if I give a gift, no one would raise eyebrows at me. But in fact, I'll be encouraged when I actually do a very warm send off to to my guests. Even the Darban, for that matter, he need not have done it. I had my water bottle, but the fact that there was a lot of thoughtfulness and care, even at the front line, for someone who opens the door for my car to think about the journey and the fact that I may need water, that was like amazing. Now, you could possibly make the best of strategy sitting in Maryland in the US, but if the front line in Missouri does not live by that strategy, it's basically as good as not having one. And that's the true test of whether there is strategy and whether there is culture that makes the strategy come alive. To me, that was like a fantastic congruence when I could see each individual, each frontline employee live their part of the strategy, because that was the experience for me as a customer. So therefore, if I reframe, or rather if I re-emphasize, to me, it can't be an either or. You need to have the strategy, but then you also need to have the culture to make that strategy come alive.
True. Basically, strategy can only be taken forward if there are people who are supporting that strategy, and it's basically feeling that purpose to take it forward. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like in your case, the experience that you mentioned, the customer delight was, one of the things that that Marriott must be working on, and that customer delight was a purpose which each employee of Marriott was actually living up to, so that they could delight the customers. Thank you so much, Sumit. That was a wonderful discussion, and your ideas about culture uh, have been really eye openers, and we listen a lot about culture, but I always feel that the more uh, you understand culture, the deeper you delve into culture, basically. And it's not something which happens overnight. It's not something which can be written in a book. It has to be experienced, and it has to, each employee is a has to take culture forward in the organization. So thank you so much once again for being a part of Point of View, and sharing your ideas with us.
Thank you so much, Ekta, for having me on this show. It was absolutely fascinating to talk about a topic that I'm personally very passionate about. And the beauty about this topic is that it relates to every individual, each one of us. So I'm glad I was able to share some ideas and reflections from my time serving these clients as well as working in these companies. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Subscribe to our channel for latest updates on leadership interviews, webinars and educative videos related to human resources, learning and development, culture, employee engagement, and many more.